Most people make the mistake of jumping into creating solutions right off the bat without fully understanding what the problem is. Donald Norman talks about how you've got to observe people where they are. So the important point here is that we didn't jump to solving a problem. We didn't say like, so what do you think the tribute should be? Instead, we said, what do we want this to communicate, or what do we want someone to experience when they go there?
Recording now. So should I start over? I'm not going to start over. It's okay. But we were flying pretty high in adrenaline when we first started working through all these changes. And what we want to talk about right now is going to be design thinking, which is a method of working through changes that allows for some of the failure. It's actually okay to stumble a little bit as long as you're learning from it. So I think that's some of the things that we want to take away from the second half of the semester here. And all this conversation this week is about is how can we learn from what we went through, and then how can we potentially design think our way through some of the solutions. So Dr. Jerry Schnepp from BGSU. Uh-oh. Sam, I need my battery stat. Jerry, give yourself an introduction. I got to do a battery swap.
Never fear, Mike. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you today. So Mike invited me because, well, we wanted to talk about design thinking, and this is something that Mike and I have had hours and hours of conversations about, which of course centers on human-centered design. And I think that's the most important part is, you know, we look at the model that's got the 5 steps to it, but the first step that is in the D school model is labeled empathy, is kind of the most important and should be sort of the guiding light through the whole process. So there was one project that Mike asked me to maybe give an overview of because it was particularly interesting. And this was the city of Defiance wanted to do a tribute to the indigenous people. And they actually started with a group of sort of city administrators, you know, the mayor and some administrators got together and started talking about what they wanted to build in terms of a tribute. And when you have a very small group of people who are kind of all in one bubble together, then it's really hard to find creative ideas. It's also hard to address the community needs. So that was the project that we took on. Mike, I see you're back. I don't know how you'd like to
okay.
do this discussion. You want to make it a sort of a two-way thing?
Well, let's just make it up as we go along, just like everything I do. So second session, second flub of the day. So we're betting 1,000. I have the main computer here plugged in. So adapting, right? That's what all of this is about. So
you handled it with grace, Mike.
Thank you. Jerry, just a quick summary of like just design thinking in general, right? You said human-centered design, but like,
oh yeah,
it's got to just, because now I don't think everybody knows exactly what we mean by design thinking.
Okay. Yeah. So it basically means, okay, so this all sort of starts with, you know, human factors and, you know, work that sort of started in the 70s and 80s, where people really started to focus on the way people use things. And that's where this came out. Design thinking was formalized at Stanford University at the D School. And it's basically, so it's a 5-step approach to problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
And when you first learn of it, you'll probably go, yeah, I sort of do this already, because it starts with interviewing and talking to and observing the people that use whatever the thing is, or whoever you're solving a problem for. And it's not until you understand those people, until you can start to move into coming up with defining a problem and moving on to solving it. Most people make the mistake of jumping into creating solutions right off the bat without fully understanding what the problem is.
It's very similar to the scientific method, where observation leads to a hypothesis that you test and iterate on from there. right? It's also founded really close to even Covey's 7 habits, right? Like seek first to understand before you try to solve any type of problem. So so how did that work for you within this Defiance project? Who is the group, and what did you learn along the way?
I worked on this with a graphic design professor, Jen Stucker. Um, we learned that they were struggling with this problem, and we decided to offer up an approach to it. And so we said we will lead some community-centered design workshops so that we can better understand what the people of Defiance value. The problem was that you had these city officials who were talking about what sort of tribute they wanted to build they were using various terms: Native Americans, people, but basically there are, in Defiance, it's the confluence of two rivers, and it historically was a place where tribes could meet and trade, and several tribes sort of had at the so rich history of trade and commerce before the area was colonized. You had this group of city officials talking about, well, I think maybe we should have a large statue of a chief with a headdress. Like things that are sort of very trite, very it's what you think about when you say, oh, a tribute to Native Americans. What is it going to look like? And you think about this headdress. And most of these sorts of installations have to do with battles, wars, chiefs, and things like that. I see Amy says borderline offensive, and yeah, I totally agree. The problem was we had this echo chamber, and it was these guys who were just sort of had kind of a one-dimensional understanding of what a tribute like this could be. And so right. Jen and I said, let's get the people of Defiance involved, and do some workshopping. So I can show you some pictures, actually.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think where this plays into the day when we talk about communication, design thinking is communication every single step of the way, right? You're talking to users, even if it's observing, that's a form of visually, like they're communicating to you through observation, getting feedback along the way, all of those things. Communication is really built into this, which is, I think, why I wanted to start out with this session. So yeah, go ahead, Jerry, share if you can.
Yeah. Well, the key thing here is that we wanted to get representative members of the community, not just people from the same social group. And so that was our first focus, was to share this invitation far and wide. I'll show you a couple pictures, so hopefully you all can see this screen.
We can see it. Awesome.
Okay, good. So we've got a wide range of participants, different age groups, different social backgrounds. And we had 2 different sessions. The first one, we got together and did sort of an empathy exercise where we started to talk about what people wanted to actually, what they wanted this thing to communicate. So the important point here is that we didn't jump to solving a problem. We didn't say, like, so what do you think the tribute should be? Instead, we said, what do we want this to communicate, or what do we want someone to experience when they go there? And we did. I see Keith is. I see Keith over there with his awesome virtual background. This should look really familiar to Keith. This is what's called an empathy map, or an empathy diagram, where we consider certain personas, and then we consider how they think and feel, what they say and do. We get a better understanding of a particular person, and that way we can design to meet the needs and expectations and goals of these particular people. Mm-hmm. So what we ended up with, and we had in the first session something, I think 40 people, and we distilled this into some selected keywords. These were the things that came out over and over again in the dialogue. is that it wasn't about, well, I guess it was different and surprisingly different than maybe what we expected. The most common word that people used was reflective. They wanted this to be a place where you could go and reflect on the history of the indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
They said it's important that it's historically accurate. It's important that we learn about history and the true history. Luckily, there's a town historian in Defiance who, his name's Randy, and I think he's in his 90s. And the guy, he's written a couple of books about the area, and he could answer all of our questions about history. And it turns out, it's not that there were all these wars and all these battles. The indigenous people sort of lived as you would expect. They were, they were families, and they were communities, and they were raising children, and they're doing all the sort of community building things that we do. And that's not how a lot of people
each other, and right.
And doing what?
And educating each other and teaching.
And educating.
Yeah, right. Like all the things that we do in our day to day that sometimes get taken for granted in the massiveness of everything that's around us. At the end of the day, people doing things, living their lives, are who we're designing for primarily.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, so I'll just quickly tell you our process for this, because this isn't. There's several different ways you could lead a workshop like this, but this was what we thought with such a big group, and we invited two different. We invited people to invite more people for the second time. So the first workshop sort of yielded these as being the most important themes. The second workshop, we had 60 people, and we put these boards all over this was in a school cafeteria in Defiance, and we gave them these blank boards. So all of these areas were blank, and they wrote in the most important word to them in the middle, and these were groups of 5 or 6, and then the secondary most important words over here, and then we came up with ideas in these spaces.
Gotcha.
And so that was the process. And then the one other thing that we did after we did this exercise, before we sort of started to distill it down, is we asked them what they don't want. And this was another really telling part of it, is they wanted it to be about community. They don't want it to be about just the leaders. They want to see women represented as much as men. We don't want it to be stereotypical or gaudy. No war bonnets. So and also it was important that it be engaging. So they said they don't want it to be static or boring, and something that you could come back to do over and over again. So this was sort of really telling, and it really helped us to guide our problem solving as we move forward.
And I think so. Employing design thinking through what we're looking at through the summer and into fall and into next year. Our Wednesday session specifically, we've got the first session is going to be a panel of learners, and we're going to listen to our learners. We're designing services and classroom and experiences for them. We're going to start with them on Wednesday. So what advice, Jerry, do you have as we start to maybe think about design thinking? Where can we learn more, and then where might what might our first step be? Because it seems like it could be a big, huge undertaking, but I don't necessarily think it really does, right? Design thinking is a way that we can, method we can use to approach even some of our smaller problems to get comfortable with the process. I mean, what are your first steps for when you?
There are certain things that you can't read about and then know. Like playing a musical instrument. You can't read about how to play guitar and then pick up a guitar and go like, oh, good, I read a book on it, so now I play guitar. And right. I think that doing human-centered design, you can learn, you can glean insights from what people have written about it, but you really just have to do it yourself. And it's not a big deal You have to just jump in and start interviewing people and learning about them. I think you get good at interviewing after you do it for a while.
And it's similar to an experience that we had. Archibald has, if anybody's ever been to Archibald, beautiful downtown, and can't help but notice a big, huge 36-foot by 127-foot white wall, exterior wall that's been prepped for a mural. They were working on it a couple of years ago, and invited myself and my class to do some potentially to help put a mural up. As we sat with leadership, one of the concerns was, well, how are we going to make sure that this not necessarily works for everybody, because there's no way to make everybody happy, but how do we make sure that what we invest, $100,000, whatever it would be, to put up on this wall is something that the community is going to appreciate? And our model was going to be the exact same way, Jerry. Let's actually go out to the community of the people who are going to have to live with this, find out what matters to them, and then make sure we're designing for them. So Dr. Thompson, as somebody who has some experience in design thinking and systems thinking, what are your thoughts on how we might be able to incorporate more design thinking into some of the decision making as we move forward?
Can I share screen? Am I allowed to do that?
Be able to.
Okay. I'd have two things. Let me see if I will probably pull this over here. Let's see what happens. Oh, pull that over there. All right, pull that over there. Hopefully I can do this. Screen share. And I will just share the screen. So I come from kind of this group of design thinking: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And I won't do an example because I really love the Defiance example. I live in Defiance. And so I've been on this world very much to design academic initiatives, like go from zero to a full-blown course for all freshmen for great orientation, mandated class in like 12 weeks. Not death by, we use design thinking to avoid death by prototype, death by trial. But I think for our purposes today, I'd like to just mention this. And this is called a tsunami decision wave that McKinsey put out. And this was before you started recording, Mike. You really hit on this, that the disruption that we're in right now is not as much about change, but it's about the speed at which the changes are coming. And so This is called a tsunami wave decisional system. And this was about a month old now. But what are this COVID-19 is about how did we get to remote operations? And now we're dealing with a recession. We are working right now. We're at phase 2 today at Northwest on returning to work. And then what's our new normal going to look like? Now, for our session, I don't want to go into the specifics of this, but more look at the time frame. This first wave is March. This second wave is now. This third wave, again, now through maybe summer. And this wave, so 4 big decision waves within 5 months. And academic institutions are not used to moving at that speed. We are not used to having that many external partners tell us how to behave and what to do.
Right.
And so the importance of this session for our listeners is that the takeaway that I take from Jerry is design thinking is one of the best ways to help you cope with this tsunami-style decisioning. And I want to stop sharing to limit our Zoom bombing potential. So Jerry, I appreciate what you said. Using design thinking is really helpful when you're trying to rapid prototype things put people first and get someplace that's meaningful, it's been very helpful as an innovation tool. I think it's going to become more and more a necessity to be able to cope with the tsunami waves that we keep getting thrown at us. And the word that I would use around it to augment what Jerry said is people-centered leadership. And I think at times of this disruption and stress, you tend to see people that move to outcome-based leadership, which is, Mike, what you talked about right at the beginning. People go into problem-solving mode and they keep trying to solve the problem the second they hear it because they want to get to an outcome. And then there's process-based leadership. And this is where design-based thinking is extremely helpful, and people stay within the value of their process, and that gives them comfort because it's chaos all around them, but we're proceeding with our process. And now I will say, got to speed it up. Can't be slow.
Right.
The leadership reading that I've done has talked about this is the time of people-based leadership. This is the time you stand up in front of your team 2 days into the emergency and say, everybody's going to get paid till the end of the academic year. Let's answer that question before you even start thinking about it. And now let's work together on our learners, right? So people-based leadership says at times like this, the most important thing are the people in the organizations. And Jerry's story about defiance and honoring is all about talking to people and understanding how they can have that expression turn into a reality. And that style of leadership has to become front and center, or we're going to burn people out, stress them out, create weird solutions that don't fit problems correctly, crash and burn. You know, one of it is we have a decision today and then tomorrow there's another problem and then tomorrow there's another problem. And there are, just for the joy of the people in the room that maybe aren't on presidential cabinets, some of my colleagues are having cabinets every day for 2 or 3 hours. And, you know, I'm very politely, I'm like, shame on you. Shame on you. No. My cabinet meets 2 times a week. We keep it within an hour. We have a 3rd time a week for a strategy session to solve important problems. If you can't get your work done in 2 hours of good time together, shame on you, because you shouldn't be beating up your leadership team that way. You need to empower people at the front lines to get all the problems done and serve them, and quit meeting and scenario planning your team to death. And so for faculty, I would say, what's the best way to plan for our learners without killing yourselves? That we can use this thinking, but at the end of the day, I'll go back to what I said earlier. How do students show their outcomes, and how can we demonstrate care for our learners who are going through a difficult situation? Put those 2 on the front burner, and then from our end, how do we care for the faculty that are doing it? We stay in those principles and guidelines, use the design thinking principles. No matter what we produce, it's going to be a great outcome.
And I think, you know, the first part of empathizing with design thinking, talking to the people who the decision is going to impact, that is why I wanted this included in the day of communication, because I think that is another thing that I've noticed as we, you know, with rapid change, as decisions get made before they can actually even be communicated effectively. And I think there's going to be some part of that, you know, I don't think there's not perfect communication. It's not going to happen. But through design thinking and empathizing up front and that initial bit of communication, I think getting enough people involved lets enough people know what's happening, so that word of mouth can do some of that heavy lifting for us when it comes to rapidly communicating to a diverse, dispersed population, especially for us, you know, in academia. So this time we've got kind of open discussion. And I want to just lead with the question, you know, what are some of the things that people out in the audience that you tried and worked, tried and didn't work? What are some of the lessons that you learned regarding communication? What went right, what went wrong for some of you? And for me, I'll start. Slack was amazing. Slack as a tool was awesome for me. I was in contact with my students. How do I say this politely? I was in contact with my students better than my peers who weren't using that tool were. That's just the reality. So what are some of the things that others that used or failed with? I know we have a big, huge, students don't read email problem. That's probably synonymous with everybody. But what other things did y'all run into out there trying to communicate?
I work with the developmental students. That's my population. So what I had were the learners who already had significant barriers intellectually, socially, technologically, and every other way you can think of. And although I like Slack for me, and I like Slack for, say, my philosophy students, my developmentals were having none of it. So this is a very human-centered question. When you have marginal students, throwing another tech at them is probably not the answer. It was incredibly labor and time intensive, but I called them on the phone. I texted their cell phones. Their advisors in the advising center called them on the phone and texted their cell phones. And that initial contact had to be a lot more personal and intimate than I'm normally comfortable with my students. But once we made that connection, then they were willing to come back and maybe send me an email. I ran Discord for one student. I ran Remind for 2 students, and everybody else immediately huddled into our learning management system and only wanted to talk to me that way. Mm-hmm. By the end of the 8 weeks, I had all of them in Zoom with me, but it took an incredibly focused effort on, I had to get to their telephone to get into contact with them.
I see that's a great insight to share, and it I think demonstrates a point that I see Julie Kling posted this comment about how Donald Norman talks about how you've got to observe people where they are. It's much more effective to understand how people work comfortably than it is to try to put them in some other context. And I think that's what you found, right? Is that you said, okay, let's use Slack, and everyone was like, it was just hard for them to adopt it. I think we see that over and over again. Mike and I, when we were working together in the Collab Lab, wanted everyone to communicate over Slack, and maybe 5 of the 12 staff members embraced it, and the other ones we had to like remind them to check their Slack and everything, and they just weren't having it. So it ended up just being for us. I see teachers who do this right. They observe how their students spend their time, and I've seen teachers use a variety of different platforms like Twitter, or sometimes students want to keep all of their schoolwork in Canvas or whatever LMS, but it's a matter of observing first how they tend to work. And it sounds like you observed that some of them just weren't into communicating using tech, so you had to make do and use cell phones.
And I think I want to preface, I think the success I had with using Slack was because it was a protocol that we had established when we were face to face and from the very beginning. It wasn't something that we just switched to. Anybody else out there with some insight into successes or not so successful endeavors trying to communicate with, not even just our learners, but even each other, right? Our peers, administration. I think everything's kind of fair game here because we can learn from all of it. If not, we'll just do it like class. I'm going to call on people.
Can we please share the slide about tsunami, more complex issues, and discuss it more?
Dr. Thompson, can you share that slide with us again? Mohammed would like to speak on that. And I think you
I'd like Dr. Thompson to speak more about that.
Oh, you would like Dr. Thompson to speak more about that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, I can do that. So Mohammed, thank you for the question. Tsunami, just in the sense of coming, if you remember, or have, hopefully never experienced one personally, it's this thing where people are sitting on a beach, and suddenly the tide goes out, and they stand up and go, "Oh, the tide's going out." And then some people understand what's going on and start going in the other direction, and the rest stand there, and then the tsunami comes, and you have people that are prepared and people that are not prepared. And in the world of tsunami decisioning, what happens, when you have that heavy disruption disaster, and your emotional energy, and Mike mentioned this at the beginning of the call, you go into adrenaline overload. Notice how my voice goes up, and I'm talking like this all the time. And so there was this burst of communications that we had at the beginning to get everybody home and fix this out and what learners are connecting and how we're doing it. And then about 2 or 3 weeks in, your adrenaline runs out. And then I noticed on virtually every call, it looked like everybody had taken some Xanax or something. Everybody's sitting there like, and I'm trying to communicate to people, by the way, there's another wave coming. And by the way, in a couple of weeks, there's going to be another wave coming. And by the way, in a couple of months, there's a third wave coming. So when I say tsunami decision, I would say some people-centered techniques that are really important. Our team spends our administrative team has designated Thursdays as a self-care day. And we want people to check in with their team members and ask them honestly how they're doing, and nudge people towards employee assistance programs if we think something's up. And we're asking faculty to touch learners maybe more regularly, as Amy just pointed out. Just talk to them on the phone or get connected with them and spot, kind of what's going on. Find the cracks that are kind of out there. And so it really says that in a people-centered space that we have to make sure that our learners are healthy. Do they have food? Do they have transportation? Do they have childcare? Because they can't learn without any of those. And so, to be able to function well in a tsunami wave decision world where large, big decisions are constantly coming at you with a huge dose of uncertainty attached to every decision. So Mike mentioned the speed, I would add the uncertainty. You keep having to make decisions with uncertain outcomes and information attached to them. It mentally drains you as a faculty member, and I would say I heard over and over again about 3 weeks left in the term, people were just tired. And what if we did this for a whole term and not just 6 weeks? So if we're going to get through the next year together in whatever version it is, I'm super excited about the opportunities we have. But let's be clear, if we don't put people first and the taking care of people first, both our learners and our teachers are going to burn out. And so you have to learn self-care and team care to be able to handle tsunami decisions coming wave after wave after wave with uncertainty, a spoonful of uncertainty with everyone. And if you don't, so Jerry and I are a tandem here. Jerry's talking about the value of design-centered people first, and I'm going to talk about self-care underneath that to make it happen. You do both those things, you'll do fine. You don't do those things, you'll be ill-prepared and burned out.
Dr. Thompson, I wonder if you might answer
Thank you.
or address a question I have about uncertainty, or about, managing complexity. So now, if you consider everything that we're dealing with, and we think about how do we approach this with human-centered design, we automatically jump to students, but also faculty. I think you can apply human-centered design principles to help faculty to be more effective. And we have an opportunity right now. It's not quite the tsunami that we had in the middle of the shutdown, right? So the shutdown, it was like you have a week or 2 weeks to put together a transition plan to online, and pretty much faculty were given carte blanche to handle it how they wanted, right? So they however they wanted to finish out the semester. But now we have summer, right? So we've got a good couple of months where we can plan, so we can be more intentional. Given that you've got that kind of breathing room, how do you approach or how do you implement human-centered design for the more complex problem of both faculty and students?
I appreciate the question, Jerry. So I'd see twofold. The one would be, I'm always a comparative storyteller, so I'll tell the comparative story. The minute Governor DeWine announced an emergency on March 10th, some of our colleagues reached out to our fellow educators and administrators in the state of Washington and said, hey, you guys had to do this like with zero notice. We have like a week or two. And they went, oh my God, if you had a week or two, let me tell you, you can do this and this and this and this. And so that's how we got started. And so now I would say we have 8 weeks. You know, we have 8 or 9 weeks. Oh my gosh, it's like a whole, I feel so blessed. It's like, oh my gosh. So the two things. One is, how do we build routine self-care into the everyday world of both our learner and particularly our faculty and staff, because that's what my job is, so that when we get to the fall, there's going to be this uncertainty that when you come to the institution that day, is today the day that we see 1,000 new cases and we're going to be told we have to pack up and go home in 3 days? Is this the day that we get told this plan and this plan can't work, or this event that we want to do has to be postponed yet again? And this learner who was with us has suddenly disappeared off the face of the map, and what happened to them? Did they go into the hospital? Did a loved one, happen? So we should take the time to routinize, to build routines. And you know well from design thinking, if you do something 30 times in a row, over, every other day, every third day, do it 30 times and your synapses start to go that way. How do we build that care in so that people can deal with the fact that you're going to be in an uncertain space, both the faculty, and the learner. And from the teaching side, and someone who teaches American government, from the teaching side, it's like I can make plans. And so I'm looking at a course that says this can be all online, this can be all face-to-face, or everything in between. And I'm designing one system that does all of that, and with the thought that if I get more of one, okay, if I get more of the other, that's okay too. And I think a third side point, just emotionally, and this is kind of a budgeting, we have yet to know from the governor what the budget bite is going to be for P12 or for post-secondary institutions. Yet by law, I will stand in front of a board virtually on June 19th with a budget. And it's really hard to stand in front of a board when you don't know whether your budget is going to go up or down by a couple of $1 million, depending upon the stroke of the governor's pen. I love the governor and what he's doing, but I have to function in that uncertainty. So you still have to make plans and do things with the best knowledge that you have. Notice how my voice and tone changed, so that you can do them in the comfort of the space that you have and just be happy that you're doing them and not freak out about 8 million scenarios that could disrupt those plans next week. So you have to keep your team, the systems thinking and people-centered leadership thinking, say no more than 2 scenarios, 3 tops at any time. Do scenario planning on 1 or 2 big things and just go in that direction, live with it, and adjust as you go. And you could wind up scenario planning your team to death in the next 12 weeks. If we do this, we do this, we do this, we do this. Send an email out. If the budget gets cut 10%, what are you going to do? If the budget gets cut 15%, what are you going to do? Yeah, we're not doing that. We've made our plan. We have a budget. We know what we're going to do. We'll adjust as we go. So I think that would be true for faculty that have content that they need to deliver. Make your plan, cool, calm, and deliberate. Figure out 2 or 3 different ways, understanding that any day you walk in that building, you might have to go home that day and not get back to it for a while. It's okay. We'll deal with it in a calm, cool, collected way that supports each other.
So we're gonna shift gears here in a second, but just to kind of sum up, Dr. Thompson and Jerry, thank you. What I heard kind of coming through that was, communication. Sometimes we feel like we don't necessarily want to communicate when we have imperfect information because we're not able to tell the full story. Dr. Thompson, you and I talked about that almost immediately when plans changed, like about that. When you have imperfect information, sometimes it's okay to let people know that, like, we've got a team that's actually working on this, because then people are aware. And I think it goes for the same as faculty. But I was reinforcing to my students, hey, we're going to get through this. We don't know exactly how yet, but as a faculty member frontline, just that bit of communication, even about uncertainty, seemed to kind of really settle them. The other thing, you know, guidance I'm reading from the state, K-12, even I'm assuming ODHE will come up with similar guidance, putting a lot of the onus on the LEAs, the local educational agencies, to plan some of this. And I think it's going to be important for us, again, with communication, to share out some of the things that we're doing, because what the problems that Alex is going to run into at West Unity are similar problems that Dustin Mays, another tech director, is going to face. Some of the challenges I'm going to have as a design faculty, Jerry, you're going to run into the same. And having those open communication and ways for us to share this type of stuff, I think that's where we can reduce some of that burnout, because we're not all trying to do everything, right? As individuals, we're all doing things collectively. So thank you both for that. Let's go ahead now.
If I could just echo that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, I just want to echo that point. I think that's a key point. The day of the lone wolf faculty member is a day of high stress and burnout right now. It can't happen. And we designed faculty so they could live in a space where it was basically subject matter expert, delivers content, best students, off we go. And what I can say is that things that we're doing at our school are doing with 42 healthcare partners on daily phone calls and phone calls with 23 community college presidents. And we're all different. We're not all going to be the same. But I can't, and our cabinet cannot build this thing alone. We constantly have to look to how other people are doing things, steal their best practice, adapt it to our culture so it fits our students, which is why I appreciate Amy talking about certain students and how, you know, landline learning is now a deal. And that if we don't do that, the value of our subject matter ability gets eroded, because we're trying to do it all ourselves. The new day, the new dawn, is how to learn from each other. So if I could pass on any single word of advice, if you're teaching English, teaching political science, whatever it is, get 4 or 5 colleagues that are doing the same darn thing and share all the work, because the uncertainty is going to force you to do more things than you're used to doing. And you want to be able to lean in with your colleagues and have a support group behind you. And faculty are really good at that. So this would be a great time for faculty to develop what I would call would be learning communities of faculty around a discipline and share information across to them, maybe more actively. We used to go to a conference a couple times a year and I'd hear death by PowerPoint on some great new idea and take it back and use it next fall. Now we're talking about a phone call on Thursday and I'm going to put it into practice on Monday. And that's the new world that we're entering. So I really want to encourage faculty to connect with other subject matter experts that are doing the same things and hear their frustrations and kind of work together on things. And people like me, we're going to support whatever you come up with. But I don't want people trying to do these things on their own. I think that's just going to be that lone wolf strategy is going to wear people out too fast.
Pretty quickly after the transition, I put out a survey and got 160 faculty members responded to the survey, and it asked them questions about transitioning quickly to online. And the single most common, the thing that was identified as being the most valuable resource for them were colleagues. We were, I was also on the university task force that put out a collection of resources, like a curated collection of resources. And it was how to best use different online tools, how to flip your lectures. It was all these sort of tutorials and resources on how to do that. And when I asked in the survey what resources were most important, there was, the largest number was faculty colleagues.
So then how do we, going forward, how might we use design thinking to increase the size and or quantity of communication in the community of practice for faculty as a way to continue conversations and lead us hopefully to idea generation, ideation, but then also sharing of that. Jerry, I mean, you did that with a list that you had, but what are some of the ways like we might be able to, Keith, this is a phrase I brought up, you know, join some of our circles. Keith, you're great at joining circles, right? Like the group that you know, Jerry, touches, I know Keith specifically because of you, Jerry. Like, I think our circles need to become overlap a little bit more as we move forward. So how might we do that? Keith, Jerry, open it up, anybody, save me from talking.
Yeah, well, an event like this is good, right? Because you're meeting some people that you probably have known for a while and have collaborated with, but you're also meeting some new people, right? And so I've already seen in the chat of like, hey, who else is interested in dealing with students with developmental abilities or whatever, right? Okay, then there's a group of folks that can start hanging out. So you sort of have to get broad and have a 100-person event like this. But one of the outcomes is then finding your group of 5 colleagues, like Jerry said, that you could, you know, be messaging every day with advice and questions. So getting broad and then narrowing down to small groups.
Well, and I, you know, people are really giving with their time and expertise. In every academic department, there's usually somebody who's super techie, who knows how to use all the tools. Mm-hmm. And then the other people can learn from them. And usually that person is very giving with their time.
Mohammed? Yes. You have something for us?
No, I'm sorry. I should mute myself.
Awesome. So what about anybody else out there? I mean, what are your thoughts with regards to communication? I know for myself, it's taxing, right? Like, teaching, grading, everything else, trying to track down students through Instagram. I was talking to some students through Instagram, some students through other platforms, any way that I could reach them. What are some ideas that maybe some of you have about things that worked for you communication-wise or didn't work?
Mike, I know we've talked about this before, but the, different protocols and ways that we can have efficiency through email, that has helped me a lot with managing the workload. I know we did our Inbox Zero presentation feels like forever ago, but just practices like that can help reduce the workload, the time that you have to dedicate to specific individual communications, and that allows you to focus more broadly on your population. I know for me, it's not as relatable with student population, but I think the same idea still applies.
And I think that's a good point too, right? Let's say best case scenario, we go back to school in the fall, 100% face-to-face. Worst case scenario, the next week they tell us we have to go back home, right? What can we do that first week that's going to establish those protocols for communication that will hopefully carry forward, so we don't have to reinvent as we go? I think that's where we might want to think on.
Now, establishing protocol from communication, my understanding is this is done through the syllabus. So having as detailed syllabus as possible that establish communications. Am I correct?
Yeah, because it usually contains your office hours and your email address and phone number and all of those things. So yeah, it probably makes sense to include some, in case of remote, verbiage in a syllabus.
Well, hey, Mike, one of the things that, you and I have talked about a lot too is that having maybe including in the syllabus and that first day, right, is your communication plan and which channels are important and where they can find things, right? We've talked about that. Also, I think that establishing, there shouldn't be any difference between your communication plan face-to-face and there is remote, right? So, I mean, if you establish, it's easy to not have that if you're face-to-face because you're going to see them, you're going to see your students 3 times a week or whatever it is. But if you establish that communication plan and you establish those tools in person, if you have to move to remote, you've already established that and there's really no change.
Yeah. Yeah. So how can we maybe come together as a group of faculty and even staff and administrators to figure out how we're going to establish base protocols for how we communicate with students?
Well, and Mike, the other thing, I mean, this is a little tangential, but, you know, we've talked about kind of communities of practice within, you know, like finding your 5, you know, English colleagues or political science colleagues or whatever. But, you know, I think, you know, one of the other concerns then is consistency across the institution, right? So as a student, if I'm going to go to I have an English teacher, and the English teachers all do it differently than the math teachers, and the math teachers do it differently than the anthropology teachers. I have a really bad experience across the board. So, I mean, I think, you know, how do we take design thinking at an individual and at this, you know, community of practice level, you know, the small groups, but how is that bubbled up to best practices across an institution? I think that's important as well.
So,
well, I just wanted to add, you know, we talked to learners at the beginning of this, and there were a couple of themes. There were some learners that really struggled because they said, when I took this course, you didn't tell me I was going to do this online thing, and I don't do online very well, and you should. And I heard all that angst. So I think we need to make sure the syllabi, to Mohammed's point, has some stock college level language, typically, that we would gather together on, that lets learners know 2 things. Uncertainty is happening, and that we might have to move the learning structure around a little bit. But 2, we have your back, and that if you need some face-to-face time, we'll figure out how to do it with an incomplete or come back a little later, but we'll get to what you need done. We're not just going to, the fear that I hear is, I'm going to get told one day I'm sent home and I have to do the rest of this with the computer, and I don't know what I'm going to do and I can't do it. So we have to both protocol it in the syllabus and assure our learners that we have their backs, I think would be a good way to say it. And so we need something like that so that the learner knows about the uncertainty the same way that I have to communicate it to the team. The faculty is going to have to communicate that uncertainty to the learner.
well, and I think that'll take some of the burden off of faculty who were left to be lone wolves as part of this, right? If we get that guidance of what the institution feels is the best practice for communication, then I am comfortable as a faculty knowing what the expectations are for me should we have to go remote, right? I think that's for everybody across the board here. What is expected of me in whatever situation that we're in goes a long way towards reducing as much of the stress about uncertainty as possible.
Can
They'll eliminate that stress. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
take the Lorax and speak for the trees for a moment? Many of my students coming in are not capable of reading some of the boilerplate language in the syllabus. It uses language, words, and constructions that they can't make sense of. They wouldn't be in a reading class if they could read. So when we're making all of these systems, if we could possibly consider a different modality than reading and writing being everything. If you look at Slack, if you look at email, if you look at pretty much every way we've tried to reach out to students, it's been textual. And my students started responding much better when I walked away from the text and started giving them audio snippets, when I started giving them a podcast, a video, something else that established that connection. Now, granted, I am honestly dealing with the lowest of the low. They cannot read at a 10th grade level when they come to me often. But thinking about those students, it's the same as the ramp and the stairs. If you shovel the ramp, everybody can go inside. If you shovel the stairs, you leave people behind.
The thing to consider there too, Amy, and you know as well as I do, making things accessible for everybody in multiple modalities, it's time and energy that is above and beyond some of what we can pull off in a day-to-day. So Dr. Thompson, the colleges having support systems for people who are trying to record audio and or video. I think that's going to be hugely important going forward. I mean, we've had the conversation about we're as much a media company going forward as we are a educational institution. So yeah, great point, Amy. All right, we are at 10:56. That will end this session. Trying to be conscious of everybody's bladder. We will be back at 11. And what do we got going on at 11 today? We are actually going to continue some of the conversation. It'll probably be an extension of this. But Alex, Brad, and I wanted to talk specifically about Slack for some of you, and other tools, not just Slack, but Slack will be the key one here, that we've used for engaging with learners in not only remote environments, but also face-to-face. So there is a Slack link out there, and you've been invited to that so you can experience it with us. Alex, would you mind sharing that again in the chat? And then we will reconvene at, let's see, 11 o'clock Eastern time. And again, if we didn't get to questions, because I know there's a lot of stuff going on in the Zoom chat, please feel free to reach out and post some stuff in Slack, anywhere and everywhere. These conversations that we're having are all important. Again, we're not going to solve everything today. All we're trying to do is join our circles together so we can move forward together. Cool? See y'all in a few. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.